June 22nd, 2025, just before dawn. The Strait of Hormuz. Oil tankers move through one of the world's most important shipping lanes. Traders watch their screens. Military commanders monitor radar feeds. Energy analysts refresh price charts. Nearly one-third of the world's seaborne oil passes through this narrow corridor between Iran and Oman. Then tensions between Iran, Israel, and the United States push global markets into a state of uncertainty. Crude oil prices react immediately. Investors begin asking the same question. What happens if energy prices surge while the United States is already carrying more than $36 trillion in federal debt? At first glance, these seem like separate stories. One is about the Middle East, the other is about Washington. But in reality, they are deeply connected. And if history is any guide, the consequences could reach every American household, every British consumer, and every major economy on Earth. Because when oil becomes expensive, governments spend more, growth slows, inflation rises, and debt becomes harder to manage. This was not an accident. The timing was not a coincidence, and the real story begins long before 2025. But to understand how we got here, we need to go back. In 1973, the Arab oil embargo demonstrated how energy could be used as a geopolitical weapon. Oil prices surged, Western economies entered recession, inflation accelerated across the United States and Europe. Then came the Iranian Revolution of 1979. Another major disruption struck global energy markets. Again, oil prices jumped. Again, governments struggled with inflation and economic instability. For decades, one lesson remained clear. When energy supplies appear threatened, markets react first and ask questions later. Fast forward to July 2015. Iran and 6 world powers signed the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, commonly known as the Iran Nuclear Deal. The agreement eased certain sanctions in exchange for restrictions on Iran's nuclear activities. Then, on May 8, 2018, the United States withdrew from the agreement and reimposed sanctions on Iran. Tensions gradually returned. Meanwhile, a different story was unfolding inside the United States. Federal debt continued rising. Major spending programs, financial crises, pandemic responses, and higher interest costs pushed government borrowing to historic levels. By 2025, debt held by the public and total federal obligations had reached figures once considered unimaginable. Two separate trends were developing: growing instability around energy supplies and growing vulnerability inside the world's largest economy. Eventually, those trends began moving toward each other. By 2025, the visible actor was Iran and its regional confrontation with Israel and the United States. The systemic force was the global energy market, which still depends heavily on oil flowing through strategic maritime choke points. The hidden beneficiary was harder to identify. Not a single government, not a single company, but energy producers benefiting from higher prices and financial traders profiting from volatility. That is how modern crises often work. Now, the stakes were rising. The Strait of Hormuz remains one of the most important energy corridors on Earth. According to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, roughly 1/5 of global petroleum liquids consumption moves through the strait. Any perceived threat to that flow immediately attracts worldwide attention. Oil traders understand something most consumers never see. Prices are driven not only by actual disruptions, they are driven by expectations. The fear of a supply shock can move markets almost as quickly as a real supply shock, and that is where the debt story enters. When oil prices rise sharply, transportation costs increase, manufacturing costs increase, airline costs increase, heating and electricity costs often increase. Inflationary pressure spreads throughout the economy. Central banks then face difficult choices. If inflation rises, interest rates may stay higher for longer. Higher rates create a major problem for heavily indebted governments. The United States Treasury must continually refinance existing debt. When rates are higher, that refinancing becomes more expensive. Interest costs rise, budget pressures increase, deficits become harder to control. For American viewers, this matters because debt service is no longer a minor budget item. It has become one of the fastest growing federal expenses. For British viewers, the lesson is similar.
Global energy shocks rarely stay local. Financial markets, currencies, inflation, and borrowing costs often move together. But what many people did not notice was the second-order effect. This was not only an oil story, it was also a confidence story. Markets constantly evaluate risk. When geopolitical instability rises, investors demand compensation. Governments, corporations, and consumers all feel the impact. This was not an accident. The timing was not a coincidence. As energy uncertainty increased, governments around the world were already wrestling with inflation concerns left over from previous economic shocks. Then came the international response. Oil importing nations monitored inventories. Energy ministries prepared contingency plans. Military forces increased surveillance around strategic waterways. Financial institutions revised forecasts. Analysts debated how much spare production capacity could